Welcome to this panel called Beyond Enhanced, the Evolution of Lawful and Science-Based Interrogation, where we will talk about both the scientific body of research that exists and the current practice. Before we get to the panel, I want to plug a book that's coming out. There are flyers over where Mark is sitting containing information about this book. It's called Interviewing and Interrogation, a review of research and practice since World War II. It contains 24 chapters from authors all over the Western Hemisphere. The book will be free to download, and we hope that it offers a state of the science overview of what we know so far about interrogation. So if you have time, please grab a flyer from Mark. And I'm very pleased to introduce panelists. Dr. Chris Kelly, Dr. Susan Brandon, Rob McFadden, and Greg Stearns. And I'm not going to spend too much time pontificating. I will simply give each speaker about 10 minutes to make the remarks, and then we're going to move to discussion followed by questions. Okay, so Susan, please.
So pardon me, I'm going to read my comments because otherwise I couldn't get them all in 10 minutes. So, my perspective is based on being a research psychologist with experience managing U.S. intelligence-funded interview and interrogation research programs from about 2006 to 2018. In 2006 and earlier, since the problems with the U.S. government interrogations post 9/11 had come to the attention of both the public and policymakers, I learned that it was thought that there had been little or no research on interrogation since the 1950s. But in fact, there had been decades of research relevant to interrogations. That is, research on how to ask another person what they know and get a credible answer. Within the domains of cognitive and social psychology, the neurosciences of brain function, the sciences of persuasion, commitment, memory, credibility assessment, negotiation, countering resistance, decision-making, biases, and attention, among others. Why were these sciences not incorporated into interrogation practices and policies? Why did we do so badly when we knew so much? Setting up a DoD-funded program of research on interrogation in 2006, although challenging, was not all that hard. People were doing research in the areas I just mentioned, among others. They were alive and well in the U.S. and abroad, and they knew how to apply for grants via various funding agencies. In the U.S., such research infrastructure has in fact been in place since the funding of the National Science Foundation in 1950. This DoD program of research was transitioned into the High Value Detainee Interrogation Group, or HIG, in 2010. The HIG put out a call for research proposals in 2010 and has continued to fund interrogation-related research ever since. To date, such sponsored researchers, including several here at this conference, have published almost 200 papers in highly respected peer-reviewed scientific journals. But they or their predecessors had been there in those same journals in 2001. So what was missing, of course, and what is still not much in place, is an infrastructure to transition such science to the practice of interrogation as it occurs in military intelligence and law enforcement contexts. A New York City cop is unlikely to read Beth Loftus' latest article, "Cannabis Increases Susceptibility to False Memory," just published in the Proceedings of the National Academies of Science. This is not to fault the researcher. The way you survive and thrive in academia is by publishing scientific research papers in peer-reviewed, respectable journals. There's no tenure track for changing local police culture. So what can be done? So I have 5 points. I'm sure others here will have added to them. Certainly, first of all, we need to continue to fund the scientists. Secondly, certainly meetings such as this, bringing scientists, policymakers, and practitioners together, is an important and vital step. Certainly, we need to collect anecdotes from practitioners who have deployed the science-based methods with successful outcomes. These are not science, but they make good stories for policymakers to use when trying to change local, state, and federal policies. Fourth, we need to advocate for change in such policies at all levels, as is being done by the Mendez Principles in the UN, by Aletheia, by, for example, California State Bill number 494, we might hear more about that would require by 2023, quote, a course for criminal law enforcement investigators and for officers training to become detectives in science-based interviewing, unquote, reflecting the HIG training course. And New York State's, quote, amendment to criminal procedure section 60.4.45 rules of evidence, admissibility of states of defendants, unquote, to exclude statements a defendant might make as a result of a law enforcement communicating false facts about evidence to them. 5, as a scientist and as a citizen, I would say that what is now needed most and is still most lacking is what are called field validation studies. In the context of our concerns here today, this means first, training interviewers and interrogators to use the science-based methods. 2, assessing whether or not after training they use these and whether or not they continue to use the old methods. And then 3, measuring outcomes. The challenges here are obvious. Who trains and whom are trained? Who pays? Who assesses outcomes? And perhaps the hardest part, what are the appropriate outcome measures? Researchers count up bits of information provided in a simulated interview context. Prosecutors count up successful prosecutions. Local police stations count up caseloads. You can see the challenge. I've been at this for the past 16 years, and I know of 6 such field validation studies to date, 2 funded by the Hague. They're small, but they're critical. Without such hard and good data, we cannot argue for efficacy or effectiveness, even while we argue for ethics. If we can't show that these science-based methods work better than the traditional methods, we're vulnerable to their staying in academia. We have to be our own best and hardest critics, lest others assume that role. So now I'm going to share some sensitive information, some data that are of vital importance to our efforts here, of the sort of data that are of vital importance. In 2015, a Hague-funded research project was published in a highly reputable journal, Law and Human Behavior. The experimental laboratory study was conducted by highly reputable psychology researchers Evan Dawson, Maria Hartwig, and Laura Brimble, then at City University of New York. The research showed that if people who had knowledge of a pending mock terrorism attack were interviewed in a room that primed openness, they were more likely to disclose information about the attack than those that were interviewed in a traditional interview room. Priming is a method developed by psychologists in the 1980s, where aspects of the environment are such that our behavior can be affected without our awareness. Advertising uses this all the time, such as when your organic grocery store puts all their fresh fruit, vegetables, and flowers at the entrance to the store. They're priming freshness. Just imagine entering the organic food store and encountering toilet paper and canned beans. Okay, and then some of the same research conducted what I thought was perhaps the most important Hague-funded study ever conducted, called Context Manipulation in Police Interviews, a field experiment by Dawson, Kelly, and Hartwig. Working in collaboration with the large American police department, which was in itself a remarkable feat in gaining mutual trust and overcoming numerous bureaucracies and took about a year in itself. Interviews with witnesses to serious violent crime were randomly conducted in a room roughly designed to be like the priming room in the earlier study, or in a traditional room. That is, they took the laboratory manipulation to the field and tested it. Witnesses in the experimental room reported it as being more comfortable setting, but there were no perceived differences in amount of information elicited. I don't question the original study. Priming is a powerful process that occurs in both non-human and human cognitive systems. And as a scientist, I think the field study is interesting. Why didn't it work? And how might we modify the design to make it work? But this is what we need to do. Partner with those who use the methods and test them in their context. It's so important to document, that is, to measure, assess, record, report how and when and why the science-based methods work in the field and when they do not. As advocates for these methods, we must be our own first and best critics. Academic researchers can't do this alone because they don't have access to these contexts. Military intelligence and law enforcement officers and agents can't do this alone because they don't know the interview methods and because they don't know how to do field validation studies. And such studies must be done by independent parties. The U.S. government should set up an infrastructure to support such research, but currently none exists. Meanwhile, we must partner at the individual and institutional levels with whatever funding we can find to accomplish this vital step.
Hi, good afternoon. I'd like to thank Mark first and foremost for inviting me and Maria for chairing that panel. My name is Greg Stearns. I'm a detective for the Los Angeles Police Department out in California. I'm in my 28th year with the department. I've spent the bulk of that 20 plus years of it working as a homicide investigator, which I still do. I am in what's called Robbery-Homicide Division, which is our specialized homicide unit. Just a quick history. When Robert Kennedy was assassinated in 1968 at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles when he was running for president, LAPD was brought in to investigate Sirhan's role in that. The department created a task force called Special Unit Senator to conduct that investigation. And in the windup of that, the department leadership felt that it was prudent to keep a standing group of homicide investigators for major cases within the city. We became operational on August 10th of 1969, and our first case was the Manson murders. So we've handled primarily serial killers, multiple murders, arson murders, murder for hire, and murders of our police officers. And if anyone watches Bosch, we're the unit that Bosch is always making fun of. So my involvement with the HIG began in 2011, I believe it was. Our captain at the time was at the IACP conference and met with George Pirro, who was then director of the HIG. I think a lot of people here know him. Most famously was the team leader for interviewing Saddam Hussein. He indicated that he had an interest in working with a major police department, particularly homicide investigators, on doing research around the metrics of what makes for a good interrogation or interview, and then what are the characteristics of a good interviewer. So Susan and her team started coming out, Chris Kelly as well. There were focus groups, there were surveys, there were roundtables with investigators, and there was also interviews of ours that were provided that had been done obviously prior to any involvement with the HIG. I was fortunate in that liaison role of being invited to go back to the HIG in 2012, and I was the first state or local law enforcement officer in the country to go through the HIG core course. It hadn't been done by anybody. Prior to that, it was just DOD agency folks or people from the FBI. And so I came away from that experience with a different perspective. I'd definitely been trained in READ. I'd been trained in confrontational techniques. I'd been trained in things like proxemics, leaning in on people to get them to tell you the truth and then backing away if you felt that they were. I'd been trained in all those things. And I came away with a much different perspective, both understanding science and the science behind some of these things, but also the collaborative process that the HIG brings to doing interviews and interrogations. The team concept, although it's very common in the UK, is something that's very foreign in domestic law enforcement here in this country. And most cops, particularly homicide cops, are very proprietary and very possessive of their interviews. And so after going through that training, I wound up talking to some of the folks that I was colleagues with back at LA, and there was a particular case that happened involving an individual who murdered and dismembered his lover, and he had been interviewed by multiple times by the lead investigators, and they took it upon themselves to say, maybe we should let you try, and maybe we should let this method be the one that we use. And so another detective who went through the training with me, we met with this guy in San Antonio, Texas. We set up a hotel room with the help of the FBI that was mic'd and wired for video and sound. And we brought this individual in and treated him like a witness. And I think what I'd like to say for a second is that, I really don't use the word interrogation anymore. It's all about interviews. And if you think about it, Suspects are witnesses. They're your best witness because they're the ones that were there. They're the ones that committed the crime. They're the eyewitness to the event. So I think that perspective is one that's controlling for me and starting to be more controlling for other people that I work with. This individual, we had gone to painstaking efforts to not only let him know that he was a witness to us and that we figured he was in the best position to tell us about the last time he saw Hervé, who was the victim in the case. His name was the suspect, Gabriel Campos, and that we needed his assistance. He said he had 30 minutes to talk to us because he had to go to work. 5.5 hours later of him speaking with us and me doing a modified cognitive interview of him, we didn't get a confession, which wasn't the goal, but we wound up with some information that was leaked by him regarding a drug that he probably used to incapacitate his victim to dismember him, and that was the difference maker in getting that case filed and getting a conviction. And we had the entire team concept. If you understand the HIG concept, there's the people in the room, there's the people out of the room. So we had one of our police psychologists there, we had a couple other detectives there, we had the lead trainer from the HIG who on his own dime came out, Simon Wells, who many of you know, he came out on his own to do this. And so this was really kind of a proof of concept for a lot of people in the department that this was something that we should be paying attention to as a way to go forward. I believe so much in what the HIG was doing, but also knowing, working for a local law enforcement agency and the cost of sending people back to Virginia for training was cost prohibitive. I presented the idea to Susan about what if we traded training for tapes. So what if we gave you stuff pre-HIG training, you come out, train guys, and then we give you stuff afterwards. So that resulted in probably a few hundred of our officers winding up getting training, most of the homicide unit RHD, as well as a lot of our undercover officers. And, it's definitely started to take root. And we were fortunate to be funded by the HIG to develop a new science-based interview and interrogation course that we started to roll out, but for the pandemic, which kind of put the brakes on training across the department. But the goal is to move that forward. And then I think the last thing I'll just say is that I don't look at the HIG method as an interview method or an interrogation method. I look at it as a communications method. And I think that when you look at some of the big issues in law enforcement today, de-escalation, dealing with the mentally ill, dealing with homeless people, dealing with all these things, I think that those concepts and those techniques and those methods have a lot of usage that is outside of an interview room. And so we've looked at how we can do injects even to our recruits in the academy and start inserting some of these concepts into their minds. But one of the things I think will be discussed in this panel is the disconnect or trying to bridge the research into practice. And a lot of times the resistance of cops to be listening to an academic that's trying to teach them that doesn't have their life experience, or just the terminology and those things being disparate. And so I've looked at opportunities to try and make things make sense for cops. So for example, if people are familiar with Paul Taylor's work on the cylinder model, talking about whether people are identity or they're instrumental or they're relational, cops are very instrumental, right? Put your hands up, turn around, get down on your knees. Whereas when we interact with a lot of people that's in some of the most intense crises of their lives, they're very identity driven. And if you can start to explain some of these things in very simple terms to cops and talk about getting into that space and understanding where that person is, if time and the situation allows it, and trying to bring them where you need them to be, those are things that make sense to cops. But I think that there has to be more done by both sides to try and take the research and make it palatable for cops and put it into a language that most cops are going to understand.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's an honor to be here. Thank you, Mark and Maria, and many folks in the audience I know I haven't seen for a while, so it's good to see you again. I was a career NCIS special agent, and a little bit of background before I get into the strange and circuitous path that got me right here today with this esteemed panel. My last position with NCIS was actually the special agent in charge for what was called the Global Support Field Office, which was a worldwide capability for sensitive and clandestine operations. Prior to that, I was a deputy assistant director for national security operations around the world for NCIS, which in that position oversight management at the headquarters level for where interview and interrogation would be more of a part of the job than my last position with NCIS. Right now, I am a Senior Advisor in the Office of the Undersecretary of Intelligence and Security, Undersecretary of Defense, Senior Advisor for CI, CT, and LE. In the previous years, though, private sector, when I retired from NCIS, I was with the Soufan Group with my good friend and partner when he was an FBI agent, Ali Soufan, and then a few years in consulting in the national security sector with Deloitte Consulting. So after introduction, the first thing I wanted to say about our panel's topic here, from my observation in advancing the science or the interview methodology based on science, evidence, and rapport, is that we're in a tremendously better position right now, empirically speaking, than we were when I started my career, midway from my career, and even when I retired from NCIS in 2011. And from my observation, it may be for a reason a little bit different than you think. And what I'm seeing is that the leadership level on making decisions about pursuit of a science-based methodology and the decider level is fantastic. And to give one example, for my previous organization, the director of NCIS, Omar Lopez, who once worked for me, and I'll take full credit for that, Dave. He, I don't know if this was covered before about the worldwide gen.
I mentioned it briefly. But
Okay, Director Lopez saw fit to send out both a doctrine and a policy memorandum to the entire special agent and all NCIS employees that the current now and the road ahead is to be a rapport-based, a science and evidence-based interview and interrogation method. And in that communique, he told the employees that we don't really care what you've learned and what you've practiced up to this point, but this is the method we're going to approach, the method we're going to teach, and this is the way forward. In paraphrasing, why? Because there's data that supports that it's the best way to go. So speaking to how serious Director Lopez was about that, there was also, in part of the implementation plan, a train-the-trainer program that went up to the supervisory special agent level so that you have that first line of supervision, overseeing, mentoring, and essentially enforcing. That's the way to go. So that's my one point in observation where it's so important for that buy-in that Susan talked about, and influencing people where we're bridging that gap and making progress from data, experiments, research to actually metrics that prove themselves in the field. Now, if I could go back a little bit about my career and my observations over the course of 30 plus years with respect to interview and interrogation. And in no false modesty, I mean, I used to have a pretty big Twitter account when I was with the Soufan Group with a modest amount of followers, but my byline was I was the Forrest Gump of the CT world, and it was no false modesty because I just happened to be there on many occasions. But way before that, when I first started out in NCIS 1990, 1991, I came from the SIGINT community. And so received the opportunity, I think in largest part because I had already a strong background with Near and Middle East, and there was a big demand signal at that time for Middle East specialists. So came aboard with NCIS at the time, and I fancied myself a highfalutin Middle East expert ready to get into not the technical part, but the human part of investigations, operations, collections, those kind of things. But at the time, I and my 49 classmates going through FLETC for the basic investigator program and the follow-on NCIS program was no one is going into the foreign counterintelligence program before you go to an assignment with a very robust felony criminal investigation mission. Now, I wasn't coming from a law enforcement background. So, for example, when I first heard the fruit of the poisonous tree, and about 3/4 of the class were all nodding their head, I said, what the hell, what's the fruit of the poisonous tree? You know, so, my point there is, an education, baptism by fire to my first office, and none other than the esteemed Mark Fallon was my first supervisor. So Mark had a nickname for my place in the organization and my place in the universe. I probably in this company shouldn't say it, but it's a kind of a metaphor that involves a dog and testicles. So that to this day is kind of stuck, actually, but or at least for a reminder. Again, sorry to bang on about this. My point, following my great disappointment that I wasn't going to go right into the high-speed foreign counterintelligence world, I went to an assignment where the everyday were homicide investigations, complex drug conspiracies, child sex abuse, aggravated assault, robbery rings, and the whole spectrum of serious felony investigations. So the point I'm trying to make there, and the blessings that I had, was that, you know, like something that you do every day, both after professional training and mentoring, like let's say a basketball player with a foul shot. From my experience, there was no substitute for having that many hundreds that became thousands of hours of interview and interrogation just about every day of the job in the felony criminal investigation context. Now, at my time at FLETC, again, without a law enforcement background, we went through, I and my classmates, the READ technique, the basic course, and then as part of the add-on, the advanced, and then the advanced READ technique. I thought that was cooler than cool, actually, because I hadn't done it before. And with great mentoring, Mark and others, I found that kind of had a natural talent, if you will, when it came to getting results from interviews and interrogations. And, you know, feeling I was calling on the READ technique training and so forth. Now, I'll jump forward in the continuum. I did finally get into foreign counterintelligence work. And before I went to my assignment that I just could not wait to get a few years after I came aboard in the Middle East, I was tapped on the shoulder to go to an advanced intelligence operations course. In fact, the most sophisticated and without doubt the best training on the face of the earth. Again, I went there scratching and clawing because I couldn't wait to get to the Middle East to become, you know, an operator, at least in my mind again. But my point there in the training is this type of training didn't have anything to do with interview interrogation, but the core principle is motivations. How to tap into motivations of human beings who might not otherwise be inclined to do what you would like them to do for a higher ideological purpose. But then closely following that too is the idea of empathy. If you don't have it naturally, the behavioral scientists say it can be taught, but it can be a bit of a challenge. So, getting successfully through the training, went to my assignment in the Middle East, and not so much interview and interrogation in the context of federal law enforcement, but for actually recruiting people for collection operations. And again, using those skills I learned both from my felony criminal investigations as well as the advanced training. Now, next part of the Forrest Gump story, through happenstance, although I had spent a lot of time there, I wound up being selected or named as the co-case agent for the USS Cole attack in Yemen with my partner Ali Soufan, and then 9/11 inextricably linked to what happened with the USS Cole and Al-Qaeda. So, as this part of the story, and I'm going to speed this up at the risk of putting even more people to sleep, I spent with my partners many, again, scores that became hundreds of hours with no kidding, card carrying, pipe hitting, scruffy beard Al-Qaeda members. Now, you want to talk about a foreign compare and contrast when talking about in the United States, in most Western societies, knowing a little bit more from people like Susan Brandon and Mike Gels and Scott Shoemate about how important it is to know about motivations in a guilt-based society like that most of us grow up in, relative to a shame-based society of most of the Near and Middle East grow in. So my point there is having that kind of training, going in with as much information as possible, the results of years of mentoring, I and my partners had pretty doggone great results. So then, part of the Forrest Gump, part of the story, I happened to be detailed by my headquarters to be part of the practitioners panel that advised the executive order for rendition, detention, interrogation very early on in the Obama administration. And I and partner practitioners recommended what became the HIG, although it went in a different direction. But the idea was to develop a professional core of career interviewers, interrogators for truly the most high-value detainee situations. So I guess for the conclusion of my remarks, I was the result, and not doing, I hope it doesn't sound like too much of this, because as a lab specimen in the Defense Science Board project on educing information, I learned from data scientists and researchers at MITRE and some academic institutions that although I talked about my great results, actually data shows that I'm the worst, or that the practitioner is usually the worst judge of efficacy and results. So again, more lessons learned, and it's an honor to have been a part of all of that, and continuing with support to the Office of the Military Commissions, and great to be here. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark and Maria, for putting this on and inviting us all to come together. I'm going to pull from a couple of different chapters I've recently written, including one in this forthcoming book, edited by Hartwig and Fallon et al. Chapter 1, I believe it is, isn't it?
It is.
The one most likely to be read, I guess. But I first want to talk about kind of three eras of interrogation research. I'm an academic, I'm a researcher, so I'm going to talk about research. And these eras are definitely not discrete. They overlap, they influence each other. We live with what we learned 50, 60, 70 years ago. But the first was the legal era, in which it was mostly scholars of law who were thinking about interrogation, what was permissible, what was not permissible. Then Miranda comes along, and how do police get along. And there wasn't a whole lot of social science behind that, though there was a little. It was under the surface, and you got to really dig to find it. But it really wasn't until the 1980s and into the 90s when this growing realization of false confessions was getting academic interest. And so what I would refer to as the empirical era began with the search for causes and consequences of false confessions. That led right into this modern era, and I think one that brings everybody here together can be thought of as the ethical era, in which case Susan and Bob and Mark and others in this room have we owe them a great bit of thanks to propelling us into this era with their work, and also drawing from researchers from the UK and elsewhere around the world. And we started to talk about human rights and eliciting reliable information, actionable information. And I didn't start my watch, so we'll just give myself 2 minutes less. You were supposed to tell me. And of course, the empirical era bleeds into the ethical era, and who knows where the ethical era goes. But most of this research can kind of be put into three buckets. Maybe it's my Catholic upbringing or my current employer, like I think in threes. Most of the research can go into laboratory experiments, which are great. And Susan kind of illuminated that to a degree. There's self-report. So lab studies, let me back up a second. Lab studies are great because they're highly controlled environments, but they are controlled environments. They're very artificial. So there's limitations. And then we have self-report, surveys, focus groups, interviews, where we learn from the experts themselves. And in the world of interviewing and interrogation, most of that research comes from the perspective of the interviewer, though there are a few notable pieces that I would recommend by Haley Cleary and Ray Bull, recent ones, who surveyed suspects who were interviewed themselves and asked about their experiences. Again, self-report, limited memory, all the rest. And then the third bucket is field research and observational research. And this is where I see myself and what I do and what Maria and I have worked on, the study that Susan mentioned about working with, I don't mind naming them. It was the Philadelphia police, and they were a pain in the ass. Haven't heard from them since. But getting into police agencies is a real challenge, as we all know, for a variety of reasons. But all of this, the eras, the methodologies, are all predominantly concerned about what the interviewer does that affects the interviewee. You know, what can we train this person to do in this proper, legal, ethical way to get what you want? What we often fail to consider is the perspective of the person on the other side of the table, and the role they are bringing into the interview. Again, with a few notable exceptions of self-reports. But there's so much more, and it's, I'm not a psychologist, and with all due respect to my psychological colleagues and Dr. Alison Nedlick, who is my academic mother, and she's a psychologist. I don't hold it against her. But we can think bigger, we can think more broadly, and we should. And it's a challenge that I offer to everybody, including myself. And so I'll, in addition to kind of flipping that causal arrow, I think we need to talk about things like the colonel from this morning. Is he still here? No. I'm sorry. Yeah, is he still here? Okay. Well, don't tell him I gave him a shout out. I think he was the first, but not the only one, to bring up the power dynamic. That's huge, and I don't think taken into consideration by researchers. It may very well be taken into consideration by the practitioners in the field, and it should, but in terms of our research models, how we understand this dynamic, I think we kind of put that to the side. We don't think about things like gender of the participants, and until I see otherwise, I think women are better interviewers, but no good large-scale systematic study has been done because most interviewers are men, still to this day, of a certain age and a certain complexion. I think there's a lot to be learned there. But then we can broaden it out even further to the interviewee's experience. And Chief, it's not just 2 years, it's not even 20 years. It's more than 200 years of history that is brought into that dynamic between a cop and a citizen, in particular an African American, that the history of policing has been one of deep, deep adversarial between the two parties. And you can hire all the officers of color and have I am friends with the deputy commissioner of DEI in New York City, NYPD. Tanya Meisenholder. I went to graduate school with her many, many moons ago. I had a conversation like, you can hire all the people you want, but that's not going to erase the history. And how we as academics and practitioners working together, policymakers, try to understand that dynamic, we can't ignore the 200 years of history, which we currently do. And I myself am guilty of that. So there is, in probably about 7 or 8 minutes, a couple hundred years of thinking and research on it. And so hopefully we go forward outside of this room, take out these ideas, and I'm looking forward to the conversation that ensues. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. So far we've talked about non-confrontational interviews. We've talked about the Mendes protocol for effective interviewing. And I want to unpack a bit what the alternative to the traditional status quo consists of. And we often name the alternative to confrontational methods rapport-based method. So I want to direct the question to the panel. What is rapport? Good luck to you.
I'll take the first swing. That's a great, really good, important question, Maria. Because I think again, from my experience, that it's often misunderstood. For example, that rapport means that it's all about, for example, in the setting of an interview room, tea and biscuits, you know, in the Middle East setting. One of the terms and agreement, consensus among the groups of those working with the Defense Science Board is that rapport could be synonymous with the term, and I don't know if it's still in play or in vogue, operational accord. And so what that meant was getting to, and I mentioned it before, understanding the motivation and trying to work toward a quid pro quo, depending on what appears to be effective, what you might know about the subject of the interview prior to the interview, how the interview goes, the interviewer's ready to pivot on a moment's notice to go in a different direction. So rapport for me, overarching, I think the most apt word is an understanding how we both get to where it's going to be a win-win situation.
I would agree with that too. From what I've observed and can see from the research, it is kind of a mutual understanding of the process and the goals, the outcome. I do think some mutual respect is an important part of it. You don't have to be friends, but some indications that I respect you as another person is usually pretty important to rapport.
I think one of the big components of rapport that doesn't really get talked about is listening. Cops have a huge tendency, especially when they're doing interviews, of doing all the talking. They do 80% of the talking. They're not listening. They've got high cognitive load. They're waiting, not even listening to the answer that they're going to get. They're already thinking about their next question or 2 or 3 questions down. So I think that one of the things that science-based interviewing tries to teach to students is that they need to do more listening. They need to do active listening. They need to do reflections and acknowledge what a person's saying and then reflect back to them so that they are understanding that the interviewer actually is listening to them and is actually understanding what they're telling them. And I think that that goes a long way towards rapport. And I think that once cops start to engage in this method, which is a break from what they've been trained to do, that they actually find that they like it because they're doing a lot less work and they're generally getting a lot more information. But I think that that's a critical aspect of building rapport, is actually to be a good listener.
Okay, I'll go.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I think that's a great point, Greg, and where I think many of us have kind of been leading is that you ask a good open-ended question that doesn't, it minimally restricts what the person can say, and that gives them the opportunity to tell their story as they understand it or as they want you to understand it, and allowing them that autonomy. There it is. To say what they want to say without being interrupted, without, getting led to a certain conclusion, I think goes a long way. But I think that's a part and parcel of a broader treating another person like a human. And I think I'm working, a colleague of mine, Dr. Nathan Meehan, is in the back here, and he and I are working on a project together, and it's got rapport at kind of the central key, the central component of it, but we are wrestling with building rapport versus maintaining rapport, because once you get into the meat, so to speak, of an interview, you could have had all the rapport if you want when you say, okay, so show me on the doll where you touched the child. Like, there goes all your rapport. So that you have to be very careful about maintaining the rapport. But I think if the treating the other person as a human throughout, regardless of what they've done, I think will go a long way to having that relationship that brings the investigation or even just the interview to a conclusion.
So from a research point of view, I think the researchers here on the panel would probably agree with me that we've had a pretty big problem in defining rapport, coming to an agreement about what that concept actually means. And given that state of affairs, I'm wondering what the panel thinks about teaching rapport and training people in rapport. Is it doable? And if so, how would you go about?
I'll start. I'll just jump right in and say, kind of just follow up on what I just said, was that I think we could probably even put the word rapport aside and do a successful training without using that and just talking about interpersonal dynamics and, you know, treating them with humanity, and rapport can be kind of tucked away as a concept under the blanket, as it were.
Yeah, I agree with that. And then it's what Greg was saying too. If you encourage someone to listen to someone, if you are listened to, you appreciate how impactful that is to be heard. So that I think that is probably one of the strategies that are most important to. And when you listen to someone, you are recognizing their autonomy. They don't have to say a thing. They can say whatever they want. And you're not giving them autonomy. People have autonomy when they come in and speak with you. So by the act of listening, you're recognizing the autonomy. You're showing that acceptance and non-judgmental responses. I think that if there was one strategy to develop rapport, I'd say that's probably it.
I think Christopher makes a really good point about perhaps depending on the setting and the curriculum, placing in the parking lot the word rapport, because it can tend to be somewhat of a buzz term, at least amongst practitioners and law enforcement. But I think a couple of key concepts. Context is really important when you're talking, teaching the idea of rapport or relationship building. And Dr. Maria, to your question that you asked at the end, can it be taught? I certainly think it can be taught. I think just about anything can be taught when you're talking about effective interview and interrogation with practice, mentoring, continuing training and education. But again, about teaching rapport, the idea is getting to where the relationship develops. Again, the context is so important. The subject of the interview, what the goals are, those types of things, what the personality appears to be at the initial, mid-stage, later on. And another really important thing that Dr. Christopher said that I agree with so much, using it for a term of convenience, rapport is a very precious thing, and it is to be preserved and taken care of and paid attention to throughout the course of the interaction with the subject. I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole, but just by way of example, gambits, for example, or lying or promising things that can't be delivered. These are the kind of things, besides disrespect, that can chip away at this precious thing we call rapport.
I think the only thing I'd add is that, excuse me, I think that this is where the planning and preparation model of the HIG method is valuable. Is that's something that's a departure for most law enforcement in the United States, to spend any meaningful amount of time planning for an interview. You might spend 15 minutes looking at someone's criminal history, talking to your partner about some objectives that you have in that interview, and that would be it, right? And maybe you've spent months, or, you know, we have cases we've spent years building investigations to get to a point that we're going to actually interview a suspect, and you're going to spend 10 minutes getting ready for it. It doesn't really make a lot of sense. And so as part of that planning and preparation, understanding your own biases that you have going into this interview, you know, the branding, if people are familiar with the branding matrix and branding exercise, about how you are being seen, how you want to be seen, how do you see that person, how do you think that person, how does that person want to be seen? Those are the things that you can start to parse out and start to roundtable and war games, so that can aid you or assist you in going into that interview and helping to build that rapport. Because I think that most commonly here, none of that is paid attention to, or people don't even understand how to do it. And once they do, and once that collaborative process takes place, I find that can go a long way towards actually building, you know, whatever this is that we call rapport.
Yeah, thank you. So we're probably all in agreement that rapport, even if we want to stay away from the term, which quite a few could recommend actually, because it may obscure more than it illuminates. An interrogation or an interview consists of more than just rapport. So one way to think about rapport is that it forms the interpersonal basis for the techniques that are then deployed. So I wanted tap the panel a bit about what are effective interviewing techniques. We know a lot about the mechanics and the dynamics of coercive interviewing protocols. We know why they lead to false confessions, why they lead investigations astray. But what is really the best practice coming out of a now non-trivial body of science?
I'll take a crack at that. I mean, I think the first thing I'll just go back to it is planning. That's not something that, again, is, germane to American law enforcement, is planning interviews. And sometimes you don't have a lot of time. We've got we call them our divisional detectives, our station detectives in LA. They may come in, a domestic violence detective, and he may have 6 people who got arrested over the weekend, and he's got to get all those cases processed by the end of the day. And so there isn't a lot of time to spend assuming that someone is willing to speak to them and hasn't invoked their rights about what it is that actually happened. But even just to take a few minutes, and I have the luxury of where I work having a lot more time usually to go and plan and prepare for interviews. So I think that in and of itself is a huge part of this. So whether it's, we talk about funnels and starting with categories and working our way down to where we want to be and being able to bridge from one to another, or the branding matrix, or, when it is that we're going to transition into another area, when we are monitoring our objectives and what we've accomplished, what's changed, what new information have we gained that may redirect where we're going to go. Like, that is such a critical component, I think, of an effective interview, is the planning component. And it's just something that really is still, I think, a fairly new concept in this country, and it really needs to be embraced a lot more.
Yeah, so it's such a good question, because you want to help people become good interviewers. But what we have done often is pull in from disparate research domains. And that ends up creating a challenge for the trainee to put it all together and fit all the parts together, because the research does come, like I mentioned, all those research domains of persuasion and communication and negotiation and credibility assessment and so on. Those are separate, very long-term, 20, 30 years research areas. And each of them have offered techniques that can be usefully deployed in an interview. And what we try to do is train some of those. So I think it would be remiss not to mention the cognitive interview, which is a 40-year interview methods that helps people remember more and describe better what they can remember. There's methods of negotiation that are relevant here, and it comes from the negotiation field. There's based similarly on methods of communication, and Greg mentioned the cylinder model, right? So that's understanding the motivation of someone speaking and getting into their same motivational frame. And that's useful for dealing with resistance. Then there's the issue of if you need to encourage people to provide more details or be more truthful, there are techniques for encouraging that. There's some probably very powerful methods of taking evidence that you have and using it most strategically in an interview in a way that encourages people to reveal more of what they know. Those are probably the biggest buckets that I could say are part of the training. But again, it's fluid, and the buckets move around, and you want to try to put them all in one bucket at some point. It can be a challenge.
I'll take the next quick swing here. Not speaking, because I don't want to embarrass myself, the latest state of the science and academic research, but from School of Hard Knocks. To your question, Maria, I just want to say a few things about traits of effective interviews from my experience. And again, the things I'll mention here, I believe they can be taught for some, like skills in, say, athletics or music or languages. Some are just more inclined naturally, their upbringing, socialization process, to be more attuned to it right off the bat. And for example, for me, I just had and always had natural curiosity, and going in there with the subject of an interview and being paid to peel the onion, as it were, that gave me a thrill. And I always thought that was important. And I noticed colleagues who are most effective tend to have that trait more naturally. And I know you use the word techniques, Maria, because again, it's convenient, but I tend to, and mentoring and training bore this out, not to be so much technique oriented, but to go in with a plan, provided to have the luxury of as much planning time. I couldn't agree with Greg more on that. Is there. Sometimes it just is not due to circumstances. But being able to, I mentioned this before, pivot very quickly, depending on what you're seeing in the behaviors, the traits, the personality, and I use that word loosely because I get into scientific trouble very quickly, as to what the reaction is, what the rapport, what the exchanges are, and then act accordingly. I know one thing that is both effective for calibrating the pace for my interviews, as well as causing a cognitive dissonance because it's just so unexpected, a good dose of sense of humor, depending on the situation. And knowing when to tap the brakes, when to speed up, and gauge it according to what's going on in the moment and where you need to go. And listening, besides empathy and cunning and guile, which came naturally for me. I don't know where that came from, but other than naturally, is very, very important.
Okay. I'll circle back around to my opening remarks and go back to thinking about the behavior of the other person, and an important message to convey to interviewers in a training or just kind of one-on-one is to not let their behavior negatively influence your own. You know, you may have someone who can be quite belligerent. The answer to belligerence is not more belligerence. And to keep the perspective of you're getting influence as much as you are trying to influence that other person, and to keep that in check. And then for Greg and Bobby, the planning, I'll channel my brothers and sisters from American law enforcement who, if they were here and not with the luxury that you have in your squad, maybe your division detectives, first thing they would say is, I don't have time for this. And maybe they're right, and sometimes, Bob, circumstances are such that you don't have it. But taking the time can impact whatever you do during the interview. If you take the time to plan it out, it will benefit in the long run.
So we're in a position now where we have a good sense of what doesn't work, what's counterproductive, and we also have, I think, much to the credit of the HIG, but it goes beyond the HIG, a substantial body of research on what actually works. Now the main hurdle, in my view, that we're facing is a translational problem, a problem of getting the research in the hands of the practitioners who need it. So I'm hoping we can have a discussion about our experiences perhaps of that and what possible remedies there might be for the situation.
I mean, I can speak from my experience. So there's some fundamental issues. In the beginning, the issue is that cops have already been trained, or if they haven't been trained, they think they've been trained. And most cops, I think, talking to people is a unique thing. You'll have cops that say, I'm not that good at shooting, or I'm not the best report writer, or I'm not the strongest in the law, but I'm good at tactics. I've never met a cop that says they don't know how to talk to people. They all think they know how to talk to people, and if they have a negative interview experience, then it wasn't their fault. It was because that person was an asshole. I mean, that's basically what most cops are going to sum it up to. And so I think one of the challenges is, and I talked about this in my opening remarks, is cops are really hard to teach that have been around, that have experience, that have tenure. They're usually crossed arms, leaning back, and especially if an academic is presenting to them, that's even more difficult. I think that some of the HIG trainers had some unique blends because they were both academics but also had worked in law enforcement for decades, so that gave them a level of credibility, I think, with some of our folks out in LA that they otherwise may not have had. I think another challenge is just also, at least from my experience, getting upper management to get involved and to be stakeholders. You get a lot of meetings with a lot of people at the top of my organization. We're the third largest police department in the country after New York and Chicago. And it would be like, I support that. And I hope this isn't going to get pushed back to my chief, but it's like, okay, I heard the words, but where's the action behind that? So I'm a working homicide detective who's also trying to push this initiative for an organization of 10,000 people. It's not the easiest rock to push up the hill. So I think that is a big challenge too, is trying to make that connection with management within an organization that is actually going to do the lift in order to get it to where it needs to be. And then it's also just, a question of money, and it's a question of hours. We're looking at trying to do injects into our police academy. I mean, our police academy is almost 1,200 hours long, and to fight to get even 2 hours of a subject when there's all these other hours that are mandated, and I see some of the cops in the room nodding their head, that the state of California is like, you have to teach this, you have to teach this, you have to teach this. And even fighting to get a small block of hours is really, really hard. So I think those are some of the obstacles, but I think the big one is that, in the same way that my captain met George Pirro at IACP, I think if there's more outreach in places like that, where annually we have this, gathering of the law enforcement executives of the United States together, and there's more presentations that are really pushing this, I think that is some place to start.
And just follow what Greg just said. I couldn't agree more with the top-driven approach. If I understand your question, Maria, about how do we get what's the state of the science out there? I'll say about the HIG. I was very disappointed to learn a number of months, or maybe a couple of years at this point, that the research part of the HIG was I don't know if disestablished is the right word, or an apparent lack of support and continue. I know the practitioner group, next to most effective training and results for high-value detainees, the other part, just as important, was the continuing research. So I can't, from my experience, overemphasize the importance of getting the latest research, the latest data-driven material out there to informed organizations like NCIS and some of our major police departments, other executive branch, federal law enforcement. That's got to be a continuing process, because we've come a long way from Mutt and Jeff as a technique, but it's a dynamic process, and the research makes gains. So that has to be pushed and be a part of a top-driven institution and culture.
If I could just jump back on that really quickly, because this is really important to me. We had a very strong relationship with the HIG at the LAPD for many years. We trained a bunch of people. We were funded to get our own program up and running. And then the HIG's shift has been back now to go teams and just being operational and dealing with high-value targets, as Robert was mentioning. I don't know who in this room, if anyone has any audience with the current director of the HIG or the HIG leadership, and I think if most people know, the HIG is comprised of DOD, the agency, and the FBI, and the FBI is always the face of the organization, but the other two entities obviously are stakeholders in an equal way. There, I think, is a huge opportunity that's being missed by the HIG and by the HIG's leadership in being able to say that we are pushing out to law enforcement across the country non-coercive, rapport-based, science-based interviewing, and the gains that could be made. And I think, especially in the political climate, and you're talking about trying to reestablish trust with the police and the community, what a huge opportunity that I think is being missed to be able to push this out and have the HIG be the face of it. And I think that the gains for not only the HIG, but for law enforcement across the country would be huge. So I don't know how to get that message to the right people, but I really think that there's an opportunity that's being missed here.
So the leadership thing is without a doubt. I had a contact within Philadelphia Police in the commissioner's office that got that study through, but once she left the agency, I was left without any real contact inside. But I've had a much longer standing and successful relationship with the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department, and that's just by virtue of a former assistant sheriff. So when he was finished his career, he was the number 2 in the agency. To go any higher, you have to get elected. But when he retired, he has a ton of credibility that he brought, that he still brings to the agency, and he's still involved in some formal ways. But it's through his efforts, nothing of my own. I just manage not to embarrass myself, and let Mike do all the work. But the other thing I'll say about the training component is that, unfortunately, you need a lot more than just a couple hours, and you need it continuously. We're all probably familiar with the old saw about, how often do you have to get certified with your weapon? Like twice a year or something? Like, how many times do you get certified to interview? Anyway, with the Las Vegas Metro Police, we did a HIG training validation study where we collected the recordings of the interviews 3 months prior to the training and 3 months after. And lo and behold, there were significant improvements in interviewing quality in the 3 months after. But you break it down by month 3, they're basically back to baseline. And so what happened in month 1 was right after the training, we're going to do this. And they did. And then it just slowly degraded over time. So the training is not just a one-off thing. It's a continuous process.
Yeah, I think I can't add too much to this. I agree that it has to leadership, policy. If we were much smaller, like some countries, we could enact and change all of the 18,000 police departments, but we can't do that. I do think that the examples that we're hearing here are that people knew someone who was interested, and a scientist got together with a former or a current officer in a police department, and they did some stuff together, and that's pretty much how it's working. And I think that's powerful. That's probably the way change happens in such a complicated environment. I would say one lesson that I learned is that if you have an opportunity to be a part of a training unit in a police department, and Greg mentioned this and Bob too, is that if I speak as an academic or a researcher, partner with a practitioner. So the training is produced and offered by a scientist and a practitioner. Both know the other's world, and not that they can work together, but they do offer the training together. So the scientist doesn't have the street creds. Generally, the officer doesn't have the depth of knowledge that the scientists have. So if you can partner together, offer the training, I have found that to be the most successful.
So I think we're coming up towards the end, and we can move to questions from the audience. Yeah.
I've got a question, and this is maybe more for Dr. Brennan and A.D. McFadden. In the defense, in the Department of Defense interrogation world, could you talk a little bit about the challenge of, and you, Dr. Hartwig, you asked about a translation issue, right? Translating science-based methodology and making that square peg fit in the round hole of FM 2-22.3, where that is required by law as the single source of 18 interrogation methods. And I'm not going to include the +1 because it's not. But can you talk about that battle to fit science-based interviewing techniques into a legal paradigm that requires something worded differently?
Susan, my good friend's looking at me because I'm still with DOD. So I'll say right up front, I have worked in a different aspect of policies. To your terrific question, I just simply don't know the answer. But I know it does remain a challenge with how big and vast DOD is. The Army has its training course in Fort Huachuca. And again, I'm not sure what's being taught there. You have the military criminal investigative organizations, OSI, NCIS, Army CID, And then you have the military department counterintelligence organizations, 3 of those I mentioned, plus Army CI. All have training, various training regimens. Most start at FLETC. So from a DoD aspect, I'm not really sure who has oversight, if there is an executive agency that looks for things like uniformity, applying the latest science methodology. So I'll defer to Susan.
Yeah, it's such a good question. I don't know if people understand this, but, per a law in 2016, 2015, all military and intelligence agencies in the U.S. that conduct interrogations in custodial settings have to use the methods that are outlined in the Army Field Manual 2-22.3, which you can download. It's an unclassified document. It has 18 methods for interrogation. About 3 align with what we know works. About 3 are there's no relevant science, and about the remainder 9 or so are at odds with the science that we know. So we dealt with this somewhat with people who are at the HIG, because the HIG has DoD interrogators, but the HIG was training the science-based methods and saying that that's what they were using. And in general, what people as an individual basis did was say, well, these fall under building rapport. And I think although they were required with each interrogation to describe which of the Army Field Manual methods they were using, they tended to stick to the ones that aligned with the science, where there were a few, avoid the ones that didn't, and say I'm building rapport using the science-based methods. But it's a huge challenge, and there was an effort to modify the Army Field Manual, and it failed, and maybe the effort is still ongoing.
This is a question for Stearns and for others who might have seen a model that works. I think a lot of what we heard today was really focused more on the academics than helping the police officer or the person in the field. And so I wanted to hear from you, your perspective on those who want to help, partner, or whatever they can provide, how you've seen that ever be effective, if you have, and if you haven't, what you would like to see.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think, I've been to the Hague Research Symposium probably half a dozen times. I've spoken on many panels there, and there's often a lot of initial interaction with researchers that say that they want to help police, but then I think that there's 2 issues. One is a lot of times there's the logistics of researchers being embedded with us, and then there's just the practical issues of that as well. That can be difficult. So there was a reporter at one point named Miles Corwin who was embedded with my division before I was a member of the unit, and he was given carte blanche by the chief of police to go anywhere he wanted. Well, our unit arrested Robert Blake, who was, if people don't remember, the guy who starred in the TV show Beretta, and they searched his home, and that reporter was present during that search, and then wound up, of course, becoming a witness on the stand and being asked a bunch of questions that he refused to answer so it turned into kind of a mess. So there's certain issues with, obviously, direct interaction in the moment when we're doing things that could occur legally. But I've also found that a lot of researchers are not able necessarily logistically to be more directly involved. I mean, I'm certainly open to that. I know that we had a individual in our counterterrorism division who's retired now, Mark Severino, who was doing a lot more of the interaction with a lot of researchers and academics. So I think that, coming up with probably like a idea of what would be something that would be beneficial both for academic research and also that would have some back-end benefit to, detectives and people that are, actually going to try and deploy the research. I think that there's conversations, at least with me, there is to be had for the next couple of years.
All right, so I think we'll conclude with that. Thank you so much to the panel, and thank you all for being here.